Welcome to Lesson 8 of the HSC course Social and Cultural Continuity and Change. In this lesson, we're mostly looking at the impact of modernisation and westernisation on social and cultural continuity and change. We're also going to introduce our country study of PNG, and that's going to be happening gradually across the series of lessons because it allows us to scaffold information into that country study, which we wouldn't otherwise have time to do if we just left the country part up to the place in the timeline where the country study starts. So we're actually going to use concepts from Papua New Guinea country study to illustrate these ideas of modernisation and westernisation. So the first thing we need to do is unpack those concepts, modernisation and westernisation, because that's the meta language of this part of the course. Probably the best way to teach this is through Blackboard style teaching a narrative. And I've done a video of the concept of westernisation in this narrative style as an example, which I'll upload for you. Hi, I'm Steph, and today we're going to be exploring the concept of westernisation. What I'd like to look at first is this isation part. What exactly is an isation? Well, it's a process that occurs over time. For the context of this course, it's a process that occurs over time. It can have a micro, meso, or macro focus, or perhaps all three. So it occurs on all three levels of the society in different ways. And it's basically just this process that's occurring over time. So in this instance, we're talking about westernisation. So we're talking about the process of becoming Western that is occurring on all three levels of society over time. So what does that even mean? What does it mean to be Western? I mean, is it, for example, about location? Does it geographically mean that you're in the West? Well, on the surface it sounds like it does, but no, it's not about location. It's actually a cultural concept. And it talks about the sort of culture that we live in, the sort of society that we live in. And I'm sure if I asked you what you think it means to be Western, you could come up with a whole lot of different things, such as you are technologically advanced, perhaps you have lots of gadgets, perhaps you have internet and connectivity. You might mention things like education, healthcare. You might also talk about this concept of West is best, which is a cultural concept that a lot of us subscribe to without actually realising that we do. So, in terms of society, what does a Western society look like? Well, it's most commonly marked by its high mass consumption. What's that about? What does that mean? Well, in a society of high mass consumption, you spend your money to get more stuff, to get a better car, a better computer, a better phone, the right pair of shoes, the right pair of jeans, and the more stuff you get and the more of the right kind of stuff you get, the better you are. Okay? So stuff is really important. Stuff is what makes you good. That's a high mass consumption society. We might have 5 pairs of jeans, but none of those pairs of jeans are exactly right. So we have to get another pair of jeans because it's not the right stuff. So if we've got all these cultures moving towards westernization, and we're all becoming more and more Western, what does that do to traditional cultures? Is it possible to maintain a traditional culture alongside this westernization process? Is it possible to maintain cultural diversity? If you have a look at the countries that are becoming Western, so countries like Japan, for example, you can see that they are embracing all this, what it means to be Western. So this whole concept of West is best. And there's an argument that there's a homogenization of culture. So if something becomes homogenous, it just means that it becomes all the same. So if we all go through this process of westernization, becoming Western, is our culture going to be the same? Well, there's lots of people that argue that it will be. That if we all become high mass consumption societies and we all become Western, that our culture will be far more similar. And a good argument for that is looking at Australia and the USA. So they used to be very different and have very, very different cultures. But now, over time, our culture has merged very much with the United States culture. So we have US TV, we have US art, so things like books, music. We have American language. So we know words that we don't use in Australia very often, things like diaper, things like pacifier. We don't use those words in Australia very often, but we know what they mean because we have American language. So there's been very much a merging of our two cultures. And the argument is that over time, as countries westernise, the same thing will happen across the board. So the next question is this a good thing? Well, in some ways it depends what you think about homogenisation of culture. So you either think that cultures will become the same, and that's a contestable statement. So you either say yes to that or no to that. Now, if you say yes to that, you either think that that's a good thing or you think that that's a bad thing. So some arguments for homogenisation of culture are things like less conflict. If all of our cultures are the same, then there's going to be less wars, less conflict that comes out of social or cultural misunderstandings. And if all of our countries are linked together economically, so economic ties, we're going to be less likely to argue with one another because we'll need one another to maintain our economies. If you think it's a bad thing, you'll be arguing things like there'll be a loss of traditional culture, And you'll be arguing things like there'll be a loss of meaning in life. If we become all about having the best car, having the best shoes, having the best phone, having enough money to buy more stuff, then we become less about the relationships that we have with one another. We become less about our humanity and more about our consumption. We become these products of high mass consumption. So if you think that cultures will not become all the same, so say your argument is sitting over here, then there's for and against that as well. So if you think they're not becoming all the same, and you think that's a good thing, you can then make arguments like cultural diversity is maintained, and that people find meaning in life. Life is less about fast cars, less about models, and more about mothers, for example. You might see the fact that we're not becoming all the same as a bad thing. And you might see that because if we become all the same, it limits conflict. And has the aforementioned economic benefits. Obviously, there's arguments to be made all around that. So you will have to think about where you sit on the concept of westernisation and what you believe, and then follow that through to its course. What do you think about that? But basically, the idea of westernisation just means that countries are becoming more Western over time. And it's the process of that occurring that we referred to as westernisation. Thanks. Okay, so you'd put that video in for westernisation. You'd also do a similar thing for the concept of modernisation, and that just introduces students to the meta language of the course. The concepts of modernisation and westernisation are probably not new. What needs to happen is a transformative phase where the knowledge that they already have about modernisation and westernisation is clarified in terms of the meta language of the course. The next thing that you'll do is show a video of cargo cults, and you'll briefly outline the story of cargo cults in Papua New Guinea. And then you'll set this homework task, which is to find 3 pictures and write 3 paragraphs about the cargo cult. The reason that you'll do it in that order is because it runs through this model. So you start off with the video of the cargo cults, and the video of the cargo cults sits here, narrative. It's narrative, and it's also background knowledge, cultural knowledge, and substantive communication. And you're going to outline briefly the story of the cargo cults. So you're going to build on the video with a little bit more of your own support. And we're going to introduce meta language of westernisation and modernisation. Students are then going to move on to this self-directed, self-regulated learning, where they find these 3 pictures and write these 3 paragraphs about the cargo cult. And this will move them to deep understanding. It will move them into higher order thinking and bring in all of these higher order concepts of knowledge integration, high expectation, and explicit criteria and engagement. So that's just an in-depth look of how we learn through the Torres Strait Islander drum model. And this particular lesson with this idea of the cargo cults and the way that I've set that out, so showing the video first, then briefly outlining the story, and then following on with a research task is a really classic example of how to move through that Torres Strait Islander drum. So you can see in our lesson we've got story sharing, we've also got the Torres Strait Islander drum, and we've just been through that. We've also got symbols and images because this concept of modernisation and westernisation is going to be a lot to do with symbols of westernization and symbols of modernization. Not only that, but the whole concept of cargo cults is all about the symbolism of West is best. So you have people with Weet-Bix boxes attached to their head because West is best, and the Weet-Bix box is a symbol of a Western society. So the whole concept of cargo cults actually works quite solidly in the realm of symbols and images. So you need to stress that when you're teaching this with your students. So I hope that was helpful, and I hope you enjoy lesson 8. Thank you.